Amen. Before I begin, I want to read something that is really good. Donna gave this to me, and it was kind of goes with what we were talking about last week on riches and things of that nature, and what we have. It says this, and this is good. Physical prosperity will never be able to overcome spiritual bankruptcy. Those are wonderful words, and what it is so true, because no matter how much money we have, if we don't have spiritual prosperity, we're bankrupt. We're bankrupt. No amount of money. No amount of money. Thank you, Donna, for that very much. Okay, we're in lesson 31. It is how to get along with others. The text that we're going to use mainly is Matthew 7, verses 1 through 11. I think the outline said 1 through 12. Verse 12 is what is called, we commonly refer to as the golden rule. And actually, we have a whole lesson just on that one verse next week. So we won't go into that very much. You might be interested to know that Luke has the same text in Luke chapter 6, 37 through 42. We'll refer to that, as I remember, once in our lesson, but mainly we're going to use Matthew chapter 7. Now, we can remember that to this point in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had given many exhortations of how we should act and treat others. Can you name a few? And I'll give you a hint, mostly in chapter, or all in chapter 5. You remember some of the things that were told in chapter 5? Well, one of them is we should be merciful and peacemakers. Verses 7 through 9 in chapter 5. We should be good influence on others. Matthew 5, 13 through 16. We should not be angry, and we should seek reconciliation when needed. Verses 38 through 40 in chapter 5. And one of the more recent ones we talked about is we should go the second mile and love our enemies. Matthew 5, 38 through 48. And now we get to chapter 7, 1 through 11, where it tells us how we are to get along with others. Let's read verses 1 and 2. Jesus says this, "Judge not, that you not be judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured back to you." Let me ask you a question. Why do you think Jesus starts off so negative? I mean, it's a flat out judge not, or your translation may say do not judge. That's pretty harsh. I mean, really right to the point. Ed. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, they were. I mean, when we talk about the relationship there, they were judging just on outward appearances and all sorts of things. One of the things that one of our handouts says, and I kind of like this, it says if you, the reason why he starts off so negative is if you want to plant a garden of beautiful flowers or vegetables, sometimes you have to pull out the weeds first. And that's true. That's true. Now, it's interesting that some think that this passage forbids judgment. Is that what Jesus is saying? No, not at all. In fact, Jesus himself said in John chapter 7, verse 24, the last part of it, to judge with righteous judgment. How would you define righteous judgment? Right in the sight of God. Virgil? Yeah. I think there's some truth in that. I would say to define righteous judgment, it's when those judgments are based on the principles of righteousness, or in other words, God's standards, kind of like what you were talking about. Okay, not our standards, not our standards. It's interesting that the Greek word translated judge is, I'll probably mispronounce it, krino or krino, Krino, the word from which we get the English word criticize. Now, we generally think of the word criticize in what kind of sense? Negative, yeah. You look up most definitions for it, and it says something along the lines of indicate the faults of someone or something in a disapproving way. Negative. Um, Pointing out the flaws of somebody else. You know, in the Marine Corps, as officers, we were taught to criticize in private, praise in public. And that was a good leadership trait, I think, to have. Um, but I found one definition that says criticize just means to evaluate. Now, that evaluation can be negative or it can be positive. It can be bad or be good. It can be destructive or it can be constructive. It really depends on what you say and quite often how you say it to someone. Galen. That's right. Yeah. That's one of my sayings that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. I'm glad it's getting out there. Maybe I should get some royalty rights or something. I don't know. But that is such a true statement. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Any other thoughts about this word criticism? Yes, Brian. No. Yeah. Yeah. When you sit down to evaluate someone's performance, I mean, it can go one of two ways. Even if that person's not performing well and it's bad, if you go in there and just slam blast them, what where are they going to be at? I mean, their self-esteem is going to be in the toilet bowl, you know? If you point out things that are in need to improve, you need to give that person ideas of how to do it, you know? I used to tell people when I was in the Marine Corps, my people that worked for me, I said, don't ever come to me with a problem unless you got an idea for a solution. You know, I want you to be thinking about how we can correct this. And when you criticize somebody, your tone of voice, the way you say it, the words you use, can make the difference between that person wanting to improve or just saying, "What's the use?" Any other thoughts on that, Virgil, and then Ed? Right. Right. Right, right. When you criticize others, and you have to document what you say to them. I mean, and what their response is, just to cover your six, so to speak. And yeah, that's important. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? Yes, Ed. I'm sorry. You right next higher up the chain. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we have to not be so thin-skinned sometimes about criticism. Constructive criticism. Um, I mentioned on Wednesday night about my old CO, Colonel Walton House, who was on that Iran rescue attempt. He was the CO of the squadron, again, finest officer I probably ever served for. I was his admin officer, and every time I took in a piece of paper for him to look at, to read, it come back with red marks. And he told me in the beginning, he said, Charles, don't think that this is bad. It's just my way of doing it. And I said, great. And I understood that. I never took offense at it. And I'll never forget one time I got a paper back. It was quite long. And I'm no red marks. And I actually took it back and just said, did you see this, sir? He goes, yeah, that's great. But those are the things, he would suggest things as we went through the paper, and you catch on after a while. You catch on. Yeah. Okay. Notice in verse 1 where it says, judge not, or if your translation says, do not judge, it is not referring to what? Legal, civil judgments. Romans 13 goes into great detail about that. How about, like Virgil was suggesting, church discipline? Yeah, no, that's okay. In fact, it's really needed. Matthew 18 verses 5 through 17 tells us how to handle for brother sins against us. You go to that person. You say, "Hey, here's the deal." You do it lovingly. If that person says, "Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't realize," I can correct whatever, you've gained your brother back. But if he tells you to go fly a kite, then you go back, remember, with one or two witnesses. Try to convince him that way. If he doesn't change his ways, then you tell the church, it says. Let the church try to correct his ways. And if that doesn't work and he just doesn't want anything to do with it, treat him like well, you don't treat him, but you consider him like a heathen, or they use the word tax collector, which was not a fond person in the Bible. It does not mean that individuals cannot make judgments, okay? In fact, we must make judgments. Look, it's not in our text, but we'll get to it later on. But for the purposes today, look at verse 15 and 16 in Matthew 7. Jesus tells us, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? And then I guess you go on to 17. It says, even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Obviously. Yeah, you got to judge here. You have to judge the doctrine taught by these teachers to determine if it is true or false and decide whether their fruits were bad or good. Any thoughts on that? Okay. The necessity of making judgments, again, is highlighted in one of our texts we're going to use today. We're going to touch upon it now, and we'll also look at it a little bit later on. But in chapter 7 of Matthew, verse 6, Jesus says, do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. What does that mean? What does it mean, you think? Don't waste your time. Exactly. What it means is that we need to use good judgment regarding those whom we teach. Okay? Burton Kaufman commentary says this about this particular passage, that the most holy things ought not to be offered indiscriminately to all persons. In such a view, the dogs and swine would refer to mean and vicious persons who have no desire to apprehend spiritual things. He goes on to say that this interpretation has come down from very ancient times, been around a long time. One caveat that I will say is I think we have to be really careful here that we don't put ourselves in a position of judging who is salvation worthy. Okay? I mean, we know, and we'll see it later on too. Jesus told the apostles, if you go into a place and they don't receive you, what do? And keep moving. Keep moving. Okay? A lot of fish to catch. And so, anyway, any thoughts on that? Yes, Brian. Yeah. Yeah. I think John the Baptist felt like that was, he needed to make it known that it was wrong to him, and maybe not just to him, but to a lot of people possibly. Yes, everybody saw it. Virgil. Yeah, could be, could be. Any other thoughts, comments? Yes, James. Yes and no. That's clear as mud now, right? I mean, okay, sometimes it takes a little longer with some people to get through, okay, or to let them, you know, decide for themselves, okay, maybe I need to listen to this, okay? But you can usually tell if someone just flat out tells you to, you know what, take a hike and doesn't want anything to do with it. I don't believe in God. You planted the seed already by just being there. And now it's up to them if they ever want it to, germinate and bear fruit. Just quit. Yeah, yeah, maybe. That's exactly a good analogy, Jack. Yeah. See, the analogy that Jesus uses here is that obviously the Word of God is valuable, okay? And pearls are valuable. So why are you expending your time and energy trying to pass on valuable things to somebody who doesn't want them? You know? Yes, Toby. Yeah. You never close that door, okay? You always tell that person, yes, Virgil, and then Geraldine. Yeah. You never know. You never know, Geraldine. Sure. Right. Yeah. Yeah. If they're just going to trample those valuable things into the ground and have nothing to do with it, save it for somebody who is more receptive. Yeah. 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 Someday, it may happen. Ed. Yeah. Yeah. If that lady just one time reflects back on the things that you said, you know, it has an effect. Anybody else? Yes. Right. Yeah. I know. That isn't that refreshing to know. I mean, think, when you leave somebody and you think, "Oh, I didn't do any good here." You never know. You never know. It's a story of a guy who's on death row, and he was given one more telephone call. And lo and behold, he called one of his high school teachers and got a hold of him. And out of the blue, he just said, "I just want to tell you, Mr. So and so, how much I appreciate all the things you did for me. You tried to get me to go straight on. I mean, just the conversation lasted like for 10 minutes because that guy tried and he made a difference. He didn't give up on the guy, he didn't push him, but he remembered that. And that was the last call he wanted to make to tell that teacher how much he appreciated all the things that he had tried to do. So you never know. Other comments? Okay. This judge not or do not judge, when you break it down, really means that it forbids personal judgment based solely upon a person's own criteria. Okay? We're flawed, right? Amen. But it commands the use of God's righteous standard of judgment. Okay? And we talked about that. We must not judge using our background only. We must not judge using our prejudices. In the beginning of verse 4 in John chapter 7, it actually says, "Do not judge by appearances." And we know that go back to that original thought was said. The old saying, "You never get a second chance to make a first impression," is true. It's true. Remember the old saying, "You can't judge a book by its cover." What does that mean? You don't know. You got to read the book really to understand it. I mean, you might not look like, um, outward appearances can be deceiving. Um, this last week, I subbed every day last week in a RSP class, resource class for lower level learning kids, and pretty basic things that we studied, basic addition, subtraction, stuff like that. Um, And I had a kid on my roster who wasn't there for a couple of days, and on the third day he showed up. And when he walked through the door, this kid looked like a gangster wannabe. I thought, man. And I mean, the way he was dressed, the way he walked, all that. So I said something to him. I said, Jesse, glad to have you. Here's the work that you've missed over the last couple of days. He took it and says, thank you very much, sir. I about fell over. And every time I spoke to that young man, it was yes, sir, no, sir, thank you, sir. Jesse, get off your phone now, remember? Oh, yes, sir, I'm sorry. 5 minutes later, Jesse, get off your phone now. Oh, sir, I'm sorry. I mean, the politest kid I've had all year. So looks can be deceiving. Anybody else had a similar incident before? Remember what James tells us in chapter 2? Turn over there real quick. This is a great illustration. James chapter 2, beginning in verse 2, says, for if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings in fine apparel, and there should be also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, you sit here in a good place. And you say to the poor man, you stand there, or you sit here at my footstool. Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Well, we do sometimes, don't we? We're guilty of it. Very much so. Any thoughts? Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe so. I get it. Uh, I don't know. One good rule is that we should not ever judge hastily. Okay? Sometimes that first impression, boy, just triggers and we get that thought, but we need not be so hasty to judge and give time for that person to maybe show who they really are. Okay? We must not judge motivation. We don't know what's in a person's heart. No way. Only judge actions. That's important when you think about it. And the reason is, again, we don't know what's in a person's heart. God does. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, in Luke's account of the sermon here, Jesus added a comment on blind leaders of the blind and their disciples, Luke 6 and 39. Jesus later referred to the Pharisees, as we talked about earlier, as blind guides of the blind in Matthew 15, 12, and 14. See, we know that Christ was rebuking the Pharisees and anyone with a Pharisaical spirit towards others. One should also notice that Luke in 6:39 says that Jesus also spoke a parable to them. And it's interesting that this is the first time in our study that we've had that word parable has been used. Obviously, we know it's going to be used a lot more later on. A lot more later on. Any questions on chapter 1? Verse 1 of chapter 7. Virgil. Yeah. Sheep's and wolves' clothing. Yeah. Yeah. I think we got to use what the term they call little street smarts. Sometimes when we are approached by somebody or when we see something, uh, you know, um, evaluate it in your brain housing group. Think about it. You know, be cautious as you initially make contact, if you will, and see what's on that person's mind, if you will. Lots of things like that. Patricia, right? Yeah. So hang on, Serena. Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, good point. Good point. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah, Ed, and then Toby, I think. Yeah, 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 yeah. Brian, let me. Toby had his hand up, then I'll get to you. Did? Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, yeah. You don't know their story. Yeah, absolutely. Good point, Brian. Yeah. All right. Well, that about wraps up verse 1. Seriously, we can make a whole series of lessons just on verse 1. Um, we're going to pick up Wednesday night on verse 2. and see how far we get then. Are there any final thoughts or comments? Great discussion, guys. Great discussion. Thank you.